So recently I did a video where I pit the two main antagonists of the two God of War sagas against each other, those being Zeus and Odin, a pair of villains that could not be more opposite in their presentation, but despite that have always been heavily compared as far as the presentation of the two different sagas are concerned. But what about the other villains? The villains that introduced the saga? While Zeus and Odin may have finished off their respective sagas, I floated the idea of pitting Ares against Baldur in the battle of the first in their saga villains. Not only that, but both being the villains from games simply called God of War. A final boss is all well and good, but a first villain is arguably more important because they're the ones that set the tone for the entire story arc, and quite the tone that was set. These are two great villains in their own right. You have the absolute maniacal brute force of Ares and the slimy insanity of Baldur, each with positives and negatives to their presentation. So with that said, it's time to pit these two villains against each other to see who is definitively and objectively the better villain. I am, of course, saying this completely ironically because this is entirely subjective and should not be taken that seriously. Either way, I'm going to be judging these villains subjectively on 9 separate points. I decided to shake it up a bit after the previous entry. This time, I'm comparing and contrasting these two opposing villains based on their intro, their personality, connection to Kratos, performance, theme song, character design, motivation, utilization, and finally, their boss fight. So long story short, I combined a few categories and added a whole new category. So without further ado, let's get started, beginning with... As you probably know, a character's introduction can be the difference maker between somebody being forgettable and iconic. Think of your favorite villains, think of the most iconic villains, and consider how they were introduced. Chances are they had an instantly impactful intro that sold exactly who they were and why they were a villain worth holding iconic status. Baldur, I think, nails this introductory phase of his character. Kratos, after mourning his dead second wife for only a short amount of time, has this mysterious stranger show up at his door determined to find the Jotun Guardian. He is simply labeled as the stranger for this entire encounter, and while he's unsuspecting, he's clearly demonstrated to be unhinged and unflappable.
And yet you hide out here in the woods like a coward.
You don't know anything about this guy, but you instantly understand that he's a giant bastard who refuses to stop poking the bear until Kratos is forced to fight. Only to find out that this mysterious stranger is not only much more powerful than he leads on, but he's also seemingly invulnerable, tanking all of Kratos' biggest hits through multiple phases of a fight that's more elaborate than some final bosses, until Kratos is able to temporarily disable him and drop him down a ravine. Everything about this intro is pitch perfect, from the way he's presented, to the gradual escalation, the mystery, his displays of power. I could not think of a more effective way to introduce a villain. So with that said, how does Ares get introduced in God of War 1? Yeah, so Ares just kinda shows up without any ceremony whatsoever. We know from a very early point that our mission is to kill him and that his forces are sacking Athens, but for all intents and purposes, Ares showing up in the game could not be more anticlimactic. He is just off in the distance in the middle of a battlefield, causing destruction. We get a dramatic camera angle of Kratos' reaction, but that's it, and later on we see him in a different position laying siege to a different part of the city. Kratos and he don't even interact. Matter of fact, they don't interact in person in the present until the end of the game. He does eventually become a worthwhile character, especially through the flashbacks, but this is almost an unfair comparison. Baldur easily takes this point, but even if Ares had an intro that was better presented, it would still be pretty hard for him to beat Baldur. When it comes to personality, the more identifiable traits, the better. When you're able to identify a character in a work of fiction purely by aspects of their personality, you know you've created a good villain or character in general. Because we as human beings are made up of many distinctive attributes of our personality. So it's good to keep it varied. Ares' personality is very in line with his distinction of being the god of war. He's cruel, he's angry, he's power hungry, and the only thing that brings him joy is destruction. But I think his lack of screen time ultimately makes his personality lack a certain degree of depth. Meanwhile, you may be mistaken in thinking that Baldur is simply completely insane, but that's just his outer shell. Underneath that shell is a tiny, desperate, traumatized child. traumatized by his mother and by his many years of a lack of sensation that she took away from him when she cursed him with invulnerability. He's cold, he's calculated, he's ruthless, he's slimy, and he's above all else, angry. And while he may be a servant to Odin, he enjoys inflicting pain on others as catharsis for his anger, and he has a pure, unbridled determination to get what he wants. Even his body language communicates his personality in how he moves like a sadistic predator who's stalking his prey that he knows has no chance to stop him. So yeah, I think by these two descriptions, it's no secret who gets the point here. Ares is an effective villain, don't get me wrong, and he's easy to hate, but as far as his personality, he's not exactly one note, but he doesn't have an exceptional amount of notes to his personality. Meanwhile, Baldur is just bursting with personality in everything he does. He's the complete opposite of one note. He's the entire orchestra. And he's one of those characters whose psyche you could dissect for days, so the point goes to Baldur. When it comes to a villain, you want one that has some sort of personal stake with the protagonist, because why should we get invested in a villain if they're not in some way linked to the protagonist? It's such an easy storytelling tool as to be a no-brainer that by giving the villain and the protagonist some sort of personal stake with each other, it's an easy way for you to get invested in both of them. Whether that be a shared experience, a personal connection, some sort of parallel that the two characters share, the list goes on. Now, first of all, Ares immediately gains the upper hand by being the half-brother of Kratos. Both of them are sons of Zeus in this continuity. Then even before Kratos had pledged himself to Ares, Ares was notable for having been involved with Kratos' life, such as in the flashbacks to Kratos' childhood, where Ares was one of the two gods who kidnapped Deimos. It's even established here that Ares struck Kratos in the right eye, which was what gave him his iconic scar. Then of course there was the entire backstory of the first game. You had Kratos pledging himself to Ares during a losing fight with a barbarian tribe, which not only gave Kratos the Blades of Chaos, his most recognizable weapons, but also resulted in him being a devout servant of Ares. Which then resulted in Ares tricking Kratos into killing his own family, which resulted in their ashes being grafted to Kratos' skin. Then he went on a 10-year quest of forgiveness before eventually facing and killing Ares in the climactic ending of the first game. So there's a lot of personal connection here that you can't deny. Meanwhile, Baldur is a little bit more interpretive in that sense, because while a lot of the conflict is built off the idea that you don't know who Baldur is for a giant chunk of the game, and a good chunk of the conflict is Baldur mistaking Kratos for the Jotun Guardian, Baldur does have a connection to Kratos in the sense that Baldur is like Kratos, at least in his younger days. He's brash, angry, and relentlessly pines for retribution beyond any sane or reasonable degree. I believe that Kratos sees a lot of himself in Baldur and wants Baldur to be the better man and let go of his anger before it's too late. To be the person that Kratos could never be. And it's only once he refuses to be the better man that Kratos is forced to kill him. I've mentioned it before, but I don't think it's a coincidence that Baldur's tattoo color is blue, which was the color of Kratos' tattoos in his beta design. Because Baldur is sort of a reflection of the person who Kratos used to be, which is a great story, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't quite carry the same weight as the story Ares had. The personal animosity with Ares was a plot that spanned most of Kratos' life until Ares was killed, and even beyond that, given that Kratos is the one tasked with replacing Ares. So I think this point can fairly decisively go to Ares. This is the new category that I decided to add after the last time, because there are a lot of ways for you to be able to judge a character generally, especially with a villain. But one of the more important ones is the performance, being able to sell the script with your acting. Because it's argued that a great actor can make anything work. That's not true, but it is argued. It is a bit unfair to Ares to have to judge his performance because he doesn't really have that much to say. So a lot of his delivery is gruff and cold.
Zeus! Do you see now what your son can do? You cast your favor on Athena, but her city lies in ruins before me.
He does show some level of range when he's making his final statement to Kratos.
Remember, Kratos, it was I who saved you in your time of greatest need.
but otherwise I can't really think of many standout moments in his performance. He's good for what he is, but he doesn't have that much to work with. Meanwhile, most of the time, Baldur has this cold, calculated sliminess to his performance.
Yes, by all means, Junior, run away. Let Daddy do all the heavy lifting for you.
He's constantly carrying himself with a level of tranquil fury. Someone who's one step from snapping, but in a quiet, subdued sense rather than a loud, bombastic, over-the-top sense. With his voice wavering like he's filled with barely suppressed rage. There's so many dramatic layers to his performance, and he's good at flipping the switch, going from an unhinged lunatic to a frightened child, and back again.
I've spent the last 100 years dreaming of this moment. I rehearsed everything I ever wanted to say to you, every word, to make you understand exactly what you stole from me.
I think what it comes down to for me is this. Ares is good. He's very good at what he does. But what he does is pretty much one thing, being a brash, imposing figure who's confident and powerful. However, I feel like Baldur is so good at playing so many different things, and a well-done, multi-layered performance can't be topped by a well-done one-note performance, so the point goes to Baldur. Okay, so this is a tough one. God of War has some really iconic music tracks, and these two boss themes are definitely up there. I kind of just went into this assuming that Ares was gonna win for the category of theme music because, I mean, it's Ares' theme, of course it's epic. It's the type of over-the-top, bombastic, aggressive musical track that sells the final fight atmosphere. It starts right out of the gate with the full orchestra and choir. It's like a musical punch to the jaw. Unfortunately, it's only a 2-minute loop, so it gets repetitive pretty quickly, and despite its epic structuring, there aren't too many specifically memorable hooks and melodies in the same way that Zeus's theme had, so it doesn't really leave a lasting impression like other tracks have. Meanwhile, the Baldur theme called Deliverance doesn't quite have the same amount of excitement to it, but I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't just a genuinely good musical track. It starts off with this dramatic string section, punctuated by the beats of the kettle drum, which gradually builds into a full orchestral track, which is dramatic and epic. Eventually, the choir gets involved as the final punctuation. It's a full 6-minute musical saga. It gradually peaks and wanes as it goes along, which means it arguably doesn't have the aggression needed to punctuate the final boss, but it's just a well-paced, well-structured song with some really good instrumentation. This is a coin flip, but at the end of the day, we have to come down to the barest appeal of these two songs, which is a question of which one I'd rather listen to in my free time, and I think I'd have to go with Deliverance. It's a well-paced, well-structured musical track that's lengthy and varied. Then, while it doesn't always hit as hard as it needs to, when it does, it's unmatched. Point Baldur. So when it comes to character design, instantly identifiable designs are something worth coveting. Think of some of the most iconic villains in the history of fiction and why they're so instantly memorable. When it comes to a character design, you want something that's striking and identifiable, but also not too busy because you don't want any one detail to be caught up in the white noise. Last time, I made the observation that Zeus in God of War is a bit underdesigned, while Odin in God of War is a bit overdesigned. This time, I think it's the complete opposite. Ares is a bit overdesigned, while Baldur is a bit underdesigned. Ares wears an armored brown tunic with various designs etched into it, shoulder guards with a Cerberus motif, then boots and wrist guards with chains wrapped around them. He also has his spider-like legs that come out of his back, as well as his giant sword. His most identifiable feature, however, is his flaming hair and beard, which juxtaposes against his pale complexion. I feel like this is a good design, however it is a touch over-designed like I said, because I never even noticed the Cerberus heads on his shoulder guards for example. Meanwhile, Baldur is shirtless and shoeless. The only clothes he wears are brown pants and some sort of apron. Makes sense for his character, he can't feel temperature so why dress warm, and he can't feel pain so why wear armor. He's lean but muscular and covered in blue tattoos. His ratty beard and hair makes him look unkempt, which visually sells his mental state. A good detail, but overall it's a very understated design. I'd say both these designs are good, but which one is better? Well, during Zeus vs. Odin, the differentiating factor was which one was the more unique design that sold the character as a God of War version of that character rather than just another version of that character, but I think both Ares and Baldur look unique in that sense. They both have distinctive enough features to be instantly identifiable, so what other factors are we looking at here? Well, Baldur's design once again sells his personality, but that's not to say that Ares' design doesn't. You can take one look at him and see exactly what kind of character he is, and also see that he means business. You can take one look at this guy and say, yep, that's definitely a god. Huh. You know what, I think I just made my decision without even realizing it. Once you eliminate all other comparisons where neither character distinctly comes out on top, you're kind of just left with the question of which of these characters look more like a god. And in that respect, it's easily Ares. So despite maybe being a bit over-designed, I think he just squeezes out a point in this case. But it could realistically go either way. A villain's motivation is arguably the most important thing they have, because just being monstrously evil and killing everyone around you can work for a horror villain, but more nuanced villains need to have a motivation that makes sense and that the audience can identify with in order to humanize them. Otherwise, you risk making a one-dimensional villain, which is a surefire way to ruin a story's potential. The motivation of Ares is simple, but by no means one-dimensional. He wants to usurp Zeus and become the ruler of Olympus, and as such he wants to create the perfect warrior. And he saw Kratos as that warrior. His desire to rule Olympus as well as jealousy of Zeus favoring Athena is what led him to decide to lay siege on Athens, kickstarting his plans to overthrow Olympus. So yeah, it's simple. In a word, he's power hungry. Meanwhile, Baldur's motivations are a little bit more complex. At first, it may seem like he's just a complete nutjob, worn down by his many years of not being able to feel anything. However, while his surface-level motivation for being out and about looking for the Guardian is based on instructions by Odin, that desire to finally feel something is what drives him. He's completely disassociated with human emotion, almost becoming a being of pure intent. Aside from that, he's also filled with his desperation for revenge against his mother Freya for putting him in this situation, to the point that even after by complete coincidence Kratos and Atreus finally break his curse, he still chooses to try and take revenge. So the 3 points of his motivation is to finally be able to feel something, to fulfill the wishes of the Allfather, and the profound desire for revenge. This one's a bit of a tough one to pick because I feel like these are both good motivations to have, and neither is explicitly better than the other for the stories they tell. But I guess, gun to my head, I think that Baldur has the better motivation simply because it's a more human and relatable motivation. I can understand what he's going through and why he goes completely insane, whereas Ares' quest for power is definitely more maniacal but doesn't have the same human element to it. So once again, the point goes to Baldur. After some consideration based on the last video I made, I decided that I would consolidate 2 of the categories simply into the blanket category of utilization. This category essentially encapsulates everything that a villain needs to be an effective villain at a moment-to-moment level while they're on screen. How many major moments they get, how effectively they're used, how many feats of power they have and how great their feats of power are, how effectively menacing they are. When they're effectively showcasing themselves as villains, are they effective villains? Basically, you want every single moment to count with them. It's like in wrestling when you're booking a strong champion. They need to be booked strong so it means more when they're defeated. They have to be booked smart, nobody likes an idiot. They have to be booked powerful, and their appearances have to mean something. They shouldn't show up for no reason. So basically, it's not necessarily who shows up the most, it's about who's booked most consistently well. Ares does mean business a lot of times. He doesn't always get physically involved, but when he does, shit gets wrecked. Meanwhile, when it comes to Baldur, his lot in life is to be able to match Kratos blow for blow, but eventually be defeated. But then he comes back like nothing happened. So when it comes to who is a more effective villain at a moment-to-moment level, who has the better ratio of good moments and strong booking, and who feels like a bigger star when they show up, I'd say it's a bit tough to decide. But honestly, once again, if you were to hold a gun to my head, I would have to give the point to Baldur for a few reasons. First of all, he doesn't show up that often, but when he does, it's always something memorable. He'll pop out of nowhere and then stab Kratos in the leg and wail on Atreus. But then he'll turn around and have a memorable scene where he's reliving the trauma that his mother put him through. Every time he shows up, Baldur kicks the crap out of Kratos or commits some ridiculous feat of strength, like casually kicking the crap out of the World Serpent. And something about the way he carries himself makes me feel like he's gonna slit your throat every time you see him. Meanwhile, Ares is definitely a well-utilized villain. I mean, not every villain in the series can say they killed Kratos, only most of them, but he does have a few moments where he just kinda shows up and doesn't really do anything positive or negative. Plus, one of the worst things you can do is make a villain look stupid, and while you can justify this moment, Ares had Kratos kill his own wife and child and then willingly admitted to it, completely miscalculating that would make Kratos a stronger warrior and a greater asset. But instead, it was the moment that ultimately kickstarted the beginning of the end for Ares. Baldur showing some vulnerability adds layers to his character. Ares being stupid makes him a less effective villain. So the point goes to Baldur. And now we get to the final category, the final boss fight, and unfortunately, Ares has already lost. I was kind of hoping this would come down to the final category, but even if I did rearrange the categories, now with Baldur having 6 points, there's no way to make that dramatic. So the question is, can Ares pick up the moral victory, or is he going to be defeated in humiliating fashion? A final boss fight is arguably the most important part of a game. It's the final capper. It's the thing that will leave the most lasting impression on the people who play the game. And a disappointing final boss can result in a slightly negative lasting impression. Odin in God of War Ragnarok. When it comes to Ares in the original God of War, I would say it's an almost perfect boss fight. Once Kratos grabs Pandora's box and powers up, while Ares commits a bit of body horror, the first stage is a relatively pure experience, just you versus Ares with everything you have at your disposal. And it's properly difficult, but in a good way. Then following that, Ares forces you into a nightmare recreation of the night you killed your wife and child, and you have to protect them against temporal clones of yourself as some sort of sadistic test from Ares to see if you can succeed where you previously failed, but it's all for naught, as no matter how well you do, Ares rips the Blades of Chaos from your arms and uses them to kill the two most important people in Kratos' life again. Disarmed and defeated, Kratos accepts defeat until he sees one more gift from the gods, the Blade of the Gods. Previously a bridge you walked across, now a vital instrument in the defeat of Ares. Thankfully, it handles almost identically to Artemis's blade. This final chunk is a bit frustrating because Ares has a seemingly unblockable short-range fireball that he can hit you with that opens you up for another attack, usually this spider leg attack, and if he does it a few times in quick succession, it can quickly turn the entire battle against you. I hate that. But all it takes is one good series of attacks to fill up your bar and Ares is finally defeated. While this boss fight has a few weaker elements and no less than 2 weird contrivances, first of all Ares simply allowing Kratos to open Pandora's box after Kratos breaks the chain, and also another moment where Ares simply allows Kratos to grab the Blade of the Gods without trying to do a follow-up stab, this is still a borderline perfect fight and one that I absolutely love every moment of. It feels like the perfect capper for everything you've learned up to this point, and a real battle of wills. Meanwhile, the final boss for Baldur is similarly epic. It starts off with Baldur basically one-manning the World Serpent and then rising up from the water like the Terminator. After a short exchange where Kratos gives Baldur one more chance to let it go and move on, it's finally time to settle this game-long conflict. The first stage of the boss fight is much like the original boss fight, where you're basically fighting completely pointlessly because he's invincible, and by stage 2 he's become vulnerable via Atreus' mistletoe quiver strap. Either way, this section is more of the same, and then section 3 and 4 are also generally more of the same with a few new attacks, particularly the elemental variation, which requires specific weapons to deal with. There are some absolutely spectacular set pieces that push the PS4 console to its limit though, so it's a spectacle of a fight with 4 evenly dispersed gameplay sections. Honestly, if I had to give the edge to anybody in this case, I think I'd have to give it to Ares. Both these boss fights are absolutely sublime in their execution, but the Ares boss fight is a 3-part boss fight that manages to have every single piece of the fight be completely fresh and interesting. Whereas the Baldur fight, despite being split into 4 parts, well, there isn't much real variance to the execution to the point where the different chunks of the boss kind of bleed together. There's a lack of escalation, and while I'd say that it's on the verge of being a perfect boss fight, it's missing a certain X factor that the Ares boss fight had. Plus, if you want to talk about the punctuation of the boss fights, Ares and Kratos have one of the most badass exchanges in the history of the series.
That night, I was trying to make you a great warrior. You succeeded.
Meanwhile, Kratos just snaps Baldur's neck after he refuses to be the better man.
The Cygolians here must be better than this.
So even in that respect, I think Ares takes the cake. And with that, the winner is 6 points to 3. Yup, it's Baldur. Yeah, I think it kind of went the way I was expecting it to. There was a point in the video's production where it was 5 points to 4, and then I was even considering declaring a tie for the theme portion, but after re-evaluating and finalizing the winners and the losers of each category, this is how it went. With Ares taking points for his connection to Kratos, his design, and his boss fight. So once again, it seems as though God of War 2005 gets points for a bit of everything: presentation, gameplay, and a bit of story. But with Baldur taking points for introduction, personality, theme, motivation, performance, and utilization, it sells Baldur and God of War 2018 taking points for almost every aspect of story and presentation, which is not a surprise to me, because that's the thing that new God of War focuses on significantly more than the classic God of War. But several of these were tough to call, and it could have gone either way, and lest we forget, this is not meant to be taken seriously. This is just a fun little creative exercise, and more than anything is built on my opinions. Don't ever forget that 2 things can be independently good. You don't have to break one thing down to build something else up if the quality speaks for itself. I like classic God of War more than new God of War, but there are certainly things I like more about modern God of War. It's not a crime to have a nuanced opinion, and liking one thing doesn't mean the other thing is automatically complete trash. Much as some people will say it is, but that's just my take. This is for entertainment, don't take it seriously. But what you should take seriously is liking this video, leaving a comment telling me what you think, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, exclusive content, and more alongside these folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Brooklyn, Dick Kickham, Gaw004, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Ty Trovy, Weird Webster, and Monster Thenardier for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.